Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now, same as earlier this week, I'm just going to do something fun, really more for myself, and I am painting up a French infantryman for the Silver Bayonet. Now, that's a gothic horror Napoleonic war game coming very soon, I believe November 11th, from Osprey Wargames. Now, you know Osprey, the guys that do all of the military history books? Well, they do an awesome line, a really, really good line of board games and war games. It is from Joseph McCullough, who's the same fella who did Stargrave, Frostgrave, and Rangers of Shadows Deep. Now, one of the really neat things about Silver Bayonet is that instead of working on a 1d20 system, it's actually 2d10. So it's a little less random, which I know some folks didn't much like about the Grave system of games. So I'm really looking forward to putting something together for it and playing some games. There's a solo mode involved as well, where you go up against the monsters, ghouls, vampires, werewolves, the works. You know, it's pretty cool. So I wanted to get some guys on the table very quickly. And this is one of the Perry Miniatures French infantry. They're in one of the newer boxes, and you'll see there are one or two details where I have not painted him strictly correctly. And I'll get into that a little bit later. All of the paints are listed in the description below. So without any further mucking around, let's get started. So if we're going to experiment, we're going to need a subject. Yes. Now I've started by priming this guy with a spray of Corax White. Now I've used this instead of a pure white because, now this is going to sound crazy, but when I'm doing British infantry, I like for them to have a little bit of warmth to them. Whereas Corax White has a very, very slight blue tint to it, which is going to affect the overall finish of our French troopers. Just suits them a little better in my opinion, and it's so minuscule as to probably be invisible by the time we put it on the table, but I like to do it, so that's what I've done. You can probably use white just fine here. And we're going to start by shading this dude all over, but I want to show you something. This is one of the little plastic covers that goes on the end of a brush. You've probably got a few dozen of these. If you've got a big old brush where you don't really need it, or you've just gotten rid of the brush or whatever, this thing, people ask me all the time where I find my pot holders that hold these things open. Don't worry about it, just slide that in there. Hey, easy as that. That pot's now going to sit open. And in that pot is our mix of Allie's Brown Liquid, which I'm finding super useful for historical stuff. So it's a mix. It's 2 parts Agrax Earthshade, 2 parts Seraphim Sepia, 1 part Lamian Medium, and then just a little bit of Drakenhof Nightshade. You can experiment with how much of that you like. I mixed up a pot because I found it easier to get the right ratio for that. But it's it's not as yellow as a Sepia, and it's not as brown as Agrax Earthshade, and the medium will help it to settle into the recesses without staining the white over much. So I'm going to cover the entire miniature in our brown goo, and then we'll give that some time to dry. So this is not a particularly taxing stage, but yeah, just make sure that you are working it into any recesses, because any little bits of white which don't end up with a little bit of this are going to really glow when it comes time to finish. Now once it's had about half an hour to dry, this is what you'll have. And all of our shading is pretty much done here. You'll see that in some areas it's a little blotchy, but we're not too worried about that because of course we're going to fix that up as we go. But for getting our shading done straight away, this works really well. But working straight from here is going to give us quite a grimy finish with our contrast. So instead I'm going to now dry brush with Praxetti White. I've got one of my old makeup brushes here. These things are the best when it comes to dry brushing. And I'll just get a little bit in the end of my brush here, and then work it off until I'm leaving almost nothing behind on a bit of kitchen towel. Now once you're satisfied you've got most of that off, what you want to do is start dry brushing. I find his hat is a really good place to start because we're going to cover most of this with other paints later. So if we have too much on our brush, it's not going to matter. But you see, as we go over the coat a few times, we start to pick up the creases and folds while leaving the shading intact in the recesses. So this will take a bit of practice because you do want to go over the whole miniature, particularly his trousers. And once his trousers have got a jam of white on them, they're pretty much finished. But let's go around now, and I am going to dry brush the whole miniature. Need some more paint with Praxetti White. Now we'll take a couple of passes to build up that white, and in some areas like his trousers, it's going to go a little bit bitty. The surface texture that Corax White has will give you a little bit of that, but don't worry, we are going to tidy as we go. Although considering this fella's supposed to be like an experienced, grimy hunter, then maybe that'll work anyway. What I've got is some Blood Angels Red. This is a contrast color, and we're going to start painting this onto, well, red bits. Now take your time here. This is very much a case for a nice slow approach. And supposedly it's much faster than painting traditionally, and I do find that's the case for some things. If you have got a nice steady hand, what you can do is even paint in the piping with this. Very carefully. So a nice small brush is a good idea here. Now that won't take very long. If you do make any mistakes, then we can touch up the white later. I'm going to need to do a last minute touch up with the white anyhow, so we're going to move on now to his skin. Now instead of using a contrast color here, I'm using Cadian Flesh Tone. Really I just like a little bit more solidity in my skin than Gilliman Flesh would offer over this. But there isn't a right way of doing it. So this is not terribly taxing, just a quick coat. Now once that's dry, we finally need to talk about what we're going to do with his coat. Now some will suggest that these should be a very, very dark blue. I quite like that look, and I think that's probably more accurate. But because we've used a shaded base coat for this, instead of using a really dark blue contrast like Leviathan blue, instead I'm going to use Ultramarines blue. Now this is technically lighter than these coats probably should be, but I think once it's all dried out, it's going to be fine. So let's tilt him sideways so it's a little easier to see what we're up to here. And we're just going to apply some of this over that coat. Now slow down when you get to any areas where you don't want to mess up the white. Just take your time. Alright, now that's not looking too bad. There are a couple of little areas where once we come back later with the white, we can tidy that up, but for now that's looking pretty good. Now we've really only got a few last details to do, so I'm going to use Space Wolves Grey here, and quite a bit of this really, to do the great coat he's got on his pack here. Now when it comes to these little things, I do suggest with these details, run a little bit more contrast into the seam where those two parts of detail meet, and that will look much better once it dries. Now while that dries, we'll go on down and paint his gaiters with a little Basilicanum Grey. Don't worry if you hit his boots, or shoes rather, because we're going to paint those black later. Just try and avoid his trousers. Now while that's drying, a little Nazdrag yellow will work for the strap on his Shako here. Now I will point out, this entire method is way easier if you're doing like 5 or 6 guys at a time, because as one guy dries, you're ready to go back to number 1 of 6. Anyway, we're going to move on to his pack, and for this I'm going to use Gore Grunter Fur. If you want to, you can sort of splotch this in such a way that you leave some of the white stuff behind, for that cowhide look, but I'm just going to do the whole thing in one color here. And then while that dries, we'll flip him around, and with some wildwood, I'm going to cover over his entire musket. The only thing I'm going to avoid is the white strap that, of course, I want to stay white. So let's get him an angle there. And when it comes to this, I'm also going to go over all of the metallic details with this. I tend to find wildwood actually works really well as a base coat of all things for silver and such like, so feel free to go nuts with this. Now speaking of silver, I really need to think about how I'm going to mark this guy out as a member of a Silver Bayonet battalion or team or group or whatever. Because according to the lore in the book, the British troops get given a little Silver Bayonet pin as a mark that they are singled out for service in these crazy missions. But I don't know quite how I'm going to show that on the French. So I'm going to do something technically incorrect with his uniform shortly. I just need to figure out what. Now here I've realized I've actually assembled this guy incorrectly. Unlike the British troops, the French didn't have a standard water bottle. So this guy here, I've accidentally given him 2 water bottles. So he's pretty thirsty. I'm going to use Skeleton Horde for the gourd. And the other one I'm going to paint in a metallic color later. Now once that wildwood has thoroughly dried, I'm going to use a little Iron Hand steel here for all of the metallic details. Now finally, this is what gave me the clue for what I was going to do with my uniform to mark him out as a member of a special group. Because this little lozenge-shaped marker on his shako here, this in reality would have been a sort of gilded brass, but I'm going to do it in silver. So that marks him out as, technically his uniform is incorrect, but he's going to fight monsters and demons and the English. So silver, yeah, I think that works quite well. Otherwise, let's fill in the rest of the silver details. So other parts of his musket, and I'm also going to do this little water canister here. Now while that was drying, you might see here that I went back with a little Blood Angels red and just popped that into the tricolor there. Now the center bit would be blue, but I'm going to paint that blue later, so don't worry about that, just saves a bit of time from later on. Now I have some Retributor armor, and I'm going to paint in any brass details. So on the front of his musket here, this bit would generally have been brass. As well, if you want to paint these guys realistically, then this would be what I'd use on the lozenge here. But no, I want a silly one. And on buttons, I've seen these in all sorts of different brassy colors. But Retributor armor, when we shade this later, is going to look the business. Now we're starting to hit the home stretch. I have here a little Vallejo black. You could use Abaddon black if that's what you've got, but I tend to find the coverage on this is a little better. So painting in any black details with this, starting with his shoes. And of course as well, we'll paint in his shako with this too. So take your time when you come near areas that you've already painted. And I mean, you could paint his hair black at the same time, but a little bit of variation in the hair color on your troops is actually going to yield some pretty cool results. So I'm going to pick a different brown, I think, and paint his hair in a couple of seconds. Now I'm always a little astonished by how quickly he looks finished once you've done the black. Once that shako's painted in, it all comes together. Now speaking of his hair, I have here, goodness, Thondia brown, but any color really will do the job. Now, short of the pom-pom here on the top of his shako, that's pretty much all of the base coats done. Now, we have already shaded him to get our initial shade, but I do want to darken down some of the colors we've now used. So I've got my Agrax Earth shade and a fairly small brush. What I'm going to do is apply this to areas where I want a little bit more shading. And I'll probably even swap down to a smaller brush and dot in some of the, the buttons. Let's quick blast over his face to get a little bit of the detail there too. Now while that's drying, we can actually move on to another stage. And we're going to do some highlights just to tidy things up a little bit here. So I have some Calgar blue because, well, we're highlighting Ultramarines blue and this is a pretty good choice. What I'm going to do is just pick out some of the extreme folds in his coat. You'll tend to find that the way that we've dry brushed and then used contrast gives you a pretty good guide on where some of these highlights ought to go. Now, as well as a couple of highlights on his sleeves, I've also done that little roundel just in the center of his shako there. Just a wee dot of Calgar blue will do the job for that. Now I've got some Ungor flesh, and this works really well as a highlight for gold braid on cloth. And what I'm going to do is just a few tiny wee driblets of this. And while we're up near his face, a little bit of Kislev flesh. This is such a funny angle to try and get this at, because he's facing away from the camera when I can reach him. But to his nose, a little bit on his cheekbones, and his chin, as well the backs of his fingers and knuckles. Just little dots of this will be quite sufficient. And then, if you like painting faces like I do, just a little wee dot of flayed one flesh at any extreme edges will help set that off even further. Now, when it comes to his trousers and any white details, we're going to go to Corax White. Now this one is kind of a pain in the neck to work with, I'll be honest. You do need an agitator in there, so get yourself some little stainless steel ball bearings, or you can pick up agitators from the army painter or other places like that. And I find a little bit of medium mixed in there to start off with will help keep it working, but you're still going to need to shake the absolute dickens out of it each time that you want to use it. But the trade-off for that is that you get a white which covers incredibly well. So I'm going to use this to tidy up his trousers and his white on his uniform. So straps and what have you, you'll find that this covers very well. Now that might just be in the realms of being fussy, but I kind of like the look. I know that some prefer slightly grubbier trousers, but that's up to you. You can decide whether or not you want to do that. Now speaking of being fussy, I have some white scar, and I'm going to do just a few little lines of pure white to really accentuate some of the folds in his clothing here, and to smarten up things like his belt crosses and what have you. Now, depending on how brave you're feeling, you can also use that as an opportunity to clean up cuffs. I did spend a bit of time on those, and I'm pretty pleased. I'm glad that I did. Because you're only going to be painting like 6 or 7 of these guys for Silver Bayonet, I'd suggest spend a little time. Sorry, I should have mentioned I've just swapped to some Stormhost Silver, and I'm going to highlight the silver, funnily enough. And then just a little bit of Liberator Gold for the buttons. Now, reason being here is this looks a little more like gilt than proper gold. Now, some of the black details I'm going to highlight with a tiny wee bit of Storm Vermin Fur. This is going to be useful as well for defining the edges of some of the parts of the Shako. You don't need to do very much of this, and though it will look quite bright going on, it will darken down a little as it dries, so don't worry too much about it looking very sharp at first. Now the final detail I've just remembered is his pom-pom, and I've mixed up Warp Lightning with some contrast medium, roughly half and half, because I don't want this to be very stark. A little bit of green here will do just fine. Now once this is dry, what I'm going to do is take him outside, hit him with a matte varnish. I'm going to use Vallejo's matte from the spray can, and we'll pop a base on him. See what he looks like when he is all done. And there at last, our French Fusilier for the Silver Bayonet is complete. And I think you can see there the difference in using contrast as base colors for most things versus using them as the be-all and end-all of a miniature. They are a little bit Marmite. Some folks really don't like them, and others swear by them. For me, as much as I use them on the channel here, they're very much a tool that depends on how you're going to be using them. For this, I think they've worked really well, particularly getting the base coats down on the pack and his coat. That was really easy, and it did actually save time versus painting them traditionally. I would have had to have done 2, maybe 3 coats of a blue to get a solid coat over that white primer. So yeah, I'd call that a win. And in particular, when it comes to the little extra details, highlights and stuff like that, because you're saving time, and with Silver Bayonet, you're only going to be painting, I think it's a maximum of 9 guys, 8 or 9 figures you can have in a, I want to say warband. I know we're not playing Necromunda or Mordheim, but warband is what comes to mind. Anyway, you've got a minimal investment of time on the group, let's say, so you can spend a little extra and really enjoy painting them. And I've really enjoyed doing this, dude. It was a lot of fun. So thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support really makes a difference, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free, drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.